So our last little piece of news before we wrap up is another study, this one by Microsoft. And it's funny because I mentioned before we started recording that when you first sent this over, I thought it was another study that I'd seen. I don't remember who produced it, but it basically talked about some challenges with like the cognitive load on AI platforms that you give it more context and they can actually start underperforming. That we right now think that more context is always better, but in some cases, depending on the use case, more context actually is worse. And what I think is what I think is interesting is, so this study is not that, but it's sort of making the same case but on the human side. So here it's saying this Microsoft study found that human cognition atrophied the more somebody used generative AI,
Hmm.
specifically. Now, I'm curious your take on this because I had to download it. I couldn't read the article, so I downloaded the actual report and started getting through. It's a research report, so it's pretty dense. But from what I understood, what I thought was interesting is it's self-reporting on sort of their confidence level.
Hmm.
So the question for me is it actually impacting cognitive ability around critical thinking, or is it simply um, changing my perception of how I think about myself in using it? And so I found it fascinating. I am a natural skeptic with this sort of self-reported data. I mean, I would have been much happier if they were putting electrodes on people's heads and measuring cognitive responses in some
Hmm.
ways, but um well, I mean, I appreciate they're at least looking at it, and I think it's going to be a very valid question as we go forward. But what was your take on this piece of research?
Yeah, so I found this really interesting. The study basically saying that after looking at 300 plus knowledge workers, that they found that these workers were less secure about their work when the more they used AI. It seems to show that we as human beings need some baseline of activity, of status quo activity, to be confident in seeing whether anomalies or other critical actions are needed or not needed in terms of to take action. And I think Microsoft, to its credit, has always had a very strong research capability. One of the few tech companies that actually takes their research very seriously from a primary research perspective, even when it's not extremely nice to their products, as this one seems to show. But I think the other issue is showing that as we work with agents, we need to maintain a certain benchmark of human activity and interaction with the jobs that we're doing. If we just leave it all to the agent, this better be for an activity that is overwhelmingly large for human cognition rather than simply easy to do, because over time we will lose our own sense of understanding when to take action and when not to take action for certain activities.
Well, it reminds me of, if you remember, we talked probably going close to a year ago about an article that Rex Woodbury of Digital Native produced,
Mm-hmm.
talking about the egg theory of AI, right? That there is this balance point of, as humans, we want to have an appropriate degree of participation to feel good about it. And so I feel like this research is probably tapping into that it's
Mm-hmm.
less about any actual cognitive decline, although I could be wrong on that, but more about this sense of accomplishment. And because I try to put myself, I was reading this research, I try to put myself into this. And like I said, I use AI extensively and I use it
Mm-hmm.
for all kinds of stuff. And I find it incredibly useful. And I do not find it disempowering. I find it sort of the opposite. I find it that I get better results out of it the more I put in, right? Where I'm dumping a whole bunch of my sort of like brain dumping, and here's what I'm thinking, and then it helps me take that to the next level.
Mm-hmm.
And I sort of take it's like, hey, that's because I was really smart in giving it all this input that it needed to produce this result. But I could see, I can understand the context. Particularly, this goes back to what you're talking about, training and the cultural transformation. For someone who sort of doesn't know how to use it, or is
Mm-hmm.
using it in this sort of highly simplistic fashion, where it's like I say, write this letter for me, and
Mm-hmm.
therefore I feel like I'm like cheating. I can see where that's going to have this impact. So I think it goes back to being very aware for if you're a CIO, if you're in the enterprise software space, being very, very aware of this egg theory challenge of how do you ensure that we're using AI to augment those abilities and to support them, and to actively elevate their engagement at this sort of cognitive level. So I think it's interesting, and I think I view it as some of the early. I don't know if you remember, we're old, but when gaming first started hitting the stride, what was it, 20 years ago, and there was all this uproar over how it was destroying the minds and turning kids into zombies and all this. And we actually found the opposite. We actually found it was actually really good for cognitive development, to the point that the US military now uses it not only for test training but testing, right, as a way, because so much of what has to happen, the ability to rapidly consume this information, digest it, and make decisions, it's actually fabulous in many, many ways. And I kind of feel like this, we're going to see the same thing with this, that this is that first sort of brush of looking at it, and we maybe are interpreting some of it wrong because we're looking at it from the wrong perspective. But like I said, and to your point, kudos to Microsoft for asking the hard questions and digging into it, regardless of which way it lands. I think it's the right questions and the things we should be considering.
Yes, and this has been a challenge with generative AI, that because it's so confident and it always creates something that is perfectly constructed from a grammatical perspective, it skews our understanding of how accurate it can be. And if we're not engaged with the process, the agentic interaction, it is easy to feel like you're just along for the ride. You're just watching instead of being part of the team. So that's obviously something that needs to be pushed against. Agents still need humans, at least at this point in time.